At the beginning of the movie, we see a husband named Paul and his wife Bea talking on a wedding video. Once seated, they talk about how they met and how Paul proposed while they were at the restaurant, and how the girl said yes. After the wedding, they head to the woods where they are going to honeymoon in a rustic cabin. This cabin is owned by Bea's family and is located in a secluded Canadian forest. When they get there, Bea starts showing the cabin, and everything in it is either worn out or too old. We also see a bear skin hanging on the wall. It turns out the girl's father liked to hunt. As night falls, intimacy begins between them, and as they cuddle on the bed, Paul asks her about the ducks in their room, to which Bea replies that they are all fake and empty inside. She then tells him about her special honeymoon dress. Later that night, as they both sleep, we see a mysterious light falling directly on their face. The next morning after breakfast, Paul again goes to the bearskin, who seems possessed and enchanted by him. Paul asks Bea about her father and his hunting, and Bea jokingly tells him that she used to kill fish and frogs with her bare hands, and did it because she enjoyed it. In the next scene, they are sailing in a boat, and it turns out that Paul is very afraid of water. Bea, on the other hand, does not have the same fear of water and decides to go swimming. However, the water in the lake is too cold, and the couple decides to abandon the idea. That same day, they go to a restaurant where none of the guests are present except for one man who is very upset and tells them that the restaurant is closed, and then breaks his lamp out of frustration as the light begins to flicker. As Paul and Bea are about to leave, it turns out that the man knows Bea and that he is a childhood friend of hers named Will. Bea recognizes him and is very happy to see her friend, so they start talking about their childhood. Will tells her that his wife Annie owns the restaurant, but that he is the one who runs everything. Annie then shows up and tells the guys to get out. Will forcefully calms Annie down and tells the newlyweds that his wife is a little unwell. At night when they go to bed, Bea can't stop thinking about Annie and her condition. Paul tries to cheer up his wife, but he doesn't have much success. The two of them fall asleep, and after a while, the lights in the house begin to flicker and Paul's alarm clock starts to ring. Paul had planned to go fishing that morning, but when he packs up and goes outside, he sees that it is still very dark outside, and the sun is still hours away from rising. He thinks that his alarm clock is broken and has gone off before the proper time. Suddenly, Paul notices that Bea is not in bed. He looks around the cabin for the girl, but she is nowhere to be found. Walking into the kitchen, he notices that the back door is not properly closed. He leaves the cabin in search of his wife. Soon Paul hears something moving in the woods, and he sets off into the woods deep into the night. He eventually finds his wife naked and unconscious. When he touches her, she is startled and screams. Paul immediately takes her home and helps her regain consciousness. The husband is horrified and asks Bea how she ended up in the woods. The girl tells him that she may have been sleepwalking and that she is fine. She continues to assure him that nothing terrible happened, but Paul doesn't seem satisfied with her words. The next morning, Bea makes him breakfast, and Paul notices that Bea is a little clumsy because she burned the bread. Paul asks her again what is going on with her. She tells him the same thing, that she is fine. Seeing his wife's condition, her husband says she should see a doctor, but Bea refuses. Paul then goes to get coffee and sees that she hasn't even gotten over it. He is very surprised by all this, for he knows that Bea has never forgotten to butter bread and has never been clumsy. Then they go to the river. Paul catches a frog and starts to play with it, but Paul sees that Bea is watching him and does not react in any way, and this also scares him, considering the fact that Bea has always laughed at frogs. Besides, she is a very cheerful person. Bea then goes for a swim in the cold water, and this also freaks Paul out because Bea always stays away from cold water. When they get back to the cabin, Paul checks on her condition again, and she tells him that she's just tired and will be fine soon. As they kiss, Paul notices marks on her thighs, and Bea begins to hide them from him. When he asks, she replies that they are apparently mosquito bites. Bea then tells him that she is going to get some sleep, leaving Paul confused. Paul goes to the same place where he found Bea last night. There he finds her nightgown and touches it, and sees an unusual liquid stain on it. Paul notices that there are several footprints in the area, and realizes that she was not alone. Back home, Paul finds Bea in front of the mirror talking to herself. She is practicing different phrases to say in different situations. Paul begins to observe Bea constantly, and realizes that there's definitely something wrong with her. When Paul tries to start romantic conversations with her, she stops him and says the same thing she has been practicing in front of the mirror, telling him that she has a headache. Paul is surprised again and asks her if something happened that night, but she tells him she was just sleepwalking. Nevertheless, Paul remains suspicious since Bea has no history of sleepwalking. As they continue to kiss, he asks her to put on her honeymoon dress, but she tells him that she put it in the wash. After hearing all of this, Paul gets really worried because he feels like he's living with a completely different person. They go to bed and we see the light falling into the cabin again. This time Paul notices notices the light. He takes his shotgun and goes out to check what happened outside. He sees someone standing in the woods, but the figure disappears as soon as Paul notices it. Paul quickly goes after this stranger, but he is nowhere to be found. To scare him away, Paul shoots into the air. Meanwhile, Bea goes to the balcony to check where the shot came from. Her husband returns home and starts locking all the doors and windows in the cabin. He then tells her that someone was outside and that he is going to follow that person. However, the girl tells him that he must be mistaken and that there was no one outside. A frustrated Paul continues to bicker with her, asking if anyone else was in the woods with her that night. But Bea continues to tell him the same thing, that there was no one else outside. Her husband suspects that Will was with Bea that night and shows her the nightgown. Paul asks her why she's lying to him about that night, and the spouse replies that she was sleepwalking, so she doesn't remember anything. They have a big fight, and Paul tells her that he just wants to protect her, but Bea replies to him that he's overreacting and ruining their special time. That night they sleep in separate rooms and are both very disturbed and scared. Waking up the next morning, Paul finds Bea writing about herself: name, age, address, and her husband's name. Paul asks her what she is writing about, and she hides the diary, telling him it is nothing. The husband is very upset that she's not acting the way she used to. The spouse tries to talk to him, but he stops being responsive. Then he asks her about those marks on her thigh, and she tells him that they've healed, but Paul notices that they've gotten worse. They don't look like insect bites to him, and instead of going away, they've gotten worse. That afternoon, as they float down the river, Paul tells her that they had better go home as he senses that something fishy is going on here. The girl refuses, claiming she is having a great time and wants to stay. They start kissing, and when it comes to continuing, Bea starts bleeding. When they get back to the cabin, Paul tells her that she should definitely see a doctor, and the girl replies that it's no big deal since she's just menstruating. However, Paul knows that it's not her period yet. Now he decides that he will confront Will, because he is the one behind all this. Paul goes to a restaurant and sees Annie there. The girl behaves the same way as Bea, and even has identical marks on her thighs. She also claims Will is hiding, and again warns Paul to stay away, then leaves. Paul then finds Will's bloody cap floating in the water. He then decides to enter their house, and notices a camera there. He tries to turn on the light, but it starts flickering. While searching, he finds several notes describing basic details about Annie, including her and Will's last names, as well as a surveillance tape of Annie following a bright light into the woods. Paul even notices on Annie's footage the same liquid that was on Bea's shirt that night. When Paul leaves the house, we see a shadow watching him. He returns home and starts reading Bea's diary. He realizes that Bea has been making similar entries and suspects her of being someone else. Paul asks her what is going on with her and Annie, and why they are both waking up and going out in the middle of the night. Bea says she just wants to protect him, whereupon Paul starts looking for his car keys in anger. Bea locks herself in the bathroom, and when Paul bursts in, he finds her stabbing herself multiple times with a genital rough. Eventually, Paul is forced to tie her to the bed. He questions her about the details of their relationship, most of which she either doesn't remember well or simply doesn't know. Feeling something moving inside her body, Bea puts Paul's hand inside her genitals and forces him to extract the large worm-like creature. At this point, Bea explains that the night she went missing in the woods, she saw the same lights as Paul and headed towards them. She then encountered a group of silhouetted figures who impregnated her with the creature. In addition, her spouse assures her that she is still herself, but the figures will take away what she has left. Upon learning the truth, Paul rushes off to find the car keys, but she insists they can't leave and suggests he watch their wedding video. Suddenly, the beam of light reappears, and Bea says she needs to hide Paul from them, at which point she knocks him out. We are then transported to the next scene where she takes him in a boat to the middle of the lake, attaching an anchor to his feet. The husband wakes up, and Bea explains that by hiding him underwater, she will protect him from the figures. Hearing this nonsense, Paul tries to escape, but it is too late. Following the death of her husband, Bea reveals that her condition is deteriorating and her skin is peeling off. She watches a wedding video, and soon after, a mysterious light appears. Bea is met by an equally gaunt Annie, and they walk into the light together. That's where the movie ends.